Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're taking a closer look at global affairs through the lens of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique perspective.
Right. We're going to be diving into his recent interview with Lex Fridman, where he really opens up about global issues and his personal relationships with world leaders.
Yeah, from his thoughts on President Trump to navigating that whole India-China situation. It's a lot to unpack.
Exactly. So let's get right into it.
Okay.
One of the things that really struck me was his take on Trump. He talked about that Howdy Modi event in Houston a few years back.
Yeah.
You know, Trump and Modi walking through that huge crowd together.
Oh, yeah. That was a pretty iconic moment.
What do you think Modi was trying to convey by highlighting that specific event?
I think it speaks volumes about the personal bond they seem to have. I mean, you have Trump willing to break protocol, trusting Modi to lead them through a crowd of thousands.
Yeah, it's not something you see every day in international politics.
Exactly, especially in a world where so much is transactional. That kind of gesture really suggests a deeper level of trust and rapport.
And it wasn't just a one-time thing either. Modi actually mentioned that Trump would consistently send his regards through mutual acquaintances even after leaving office.
It's interesting, right? That's not typical behavior. It definitely hints at a genuine connection that probably influenced their policy interactions during Trump's time in office.
Makes you wonder how much personal relationships actually shaped the course of global events.
Right.
Speaking of shaping global events, Modi also suggested that Trump is more prepared for a second presidential run.
Ah,
He even pointed to Trump's team this time around people like Tulsi Gabbard, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Elon Musk. Modi described the atmosphere around Trump as family-like.
family-like, huh? That's a curious choice of words. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, it seems like he was trying to get at the idea of a more cohesive unit, maybe a shared vision.
I wonder if it signals a shift in how Trump might approach things if he were to be reelected. Could this have implications for future U.S.-India relations?
Yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about India's relationship with China. It's no secret that there have been some tensions, especially along the border.
Yeah, a very complicated relationship.
But Modi seems to be emphasizing this idea of restoring normalcy, especially after his meeting with President Xi. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's important to look at the historical context here.
Right.
India and China have a long and complex relationship, centuries of cooperation alongside more recent border disputes. It's a delicate balance.
And you have to factor in their economic ambitions, their geopolitical aspirations. It's a lot to navigate.
Exactly.
It seems like Modi is really focused on dialogue, though, making sure their differences don't spiral into something bigger.
He's definitely walking a tightrope.
He even talks about the need for healthy competition between these two Asian giants.
That's key, right? He's not framing it as a conflict, but as a competition. And that's a crucial distinction in today's world.
Especially considering their growing influence, both economically and geopolitically. It makes you think, are we witnessing the rise of a new world order with India and China at the forefront?
It's a question worth asking.
It is. Okay, let's move on to another delicate situation. The war in Ukraine. Modi is very clear about his close ties with both Russia and Ukraine.
Right.
But he also believes that a resolution can only come through negotiations.
It's an interesting position, especially given the pressure from the West to take a stronger stance against Russia. He seems to be trying to maintain a neutral position.
Yeah, and he's been consistent with his calls for peace from the beginning. He even shared that he told Zelensky directly that a resolution won't be found on the battlefield. So it begs the question, can India actually play a mediating role in this conflict?
It's hard to say. But with India's historical ties to Russia and its increasing global influence, I think Modi's perspective could have a real impact.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds.
Yeah.
All right, let's turn our attention to a topic that has been a constant source of tension for India: Pakistan. Modi doesn't mince words when it comes to Pakistan's role in fostering terrorism.
It's a deep-seated issue.
Right. He states very clearly that the world no longer has any doubt about where terrorism originates. It really reflects the deep mistrust that has shaped India-Pakistan relations for decades. And for Modi, Pakistan's actions are basically a proxy war against India. He seems to believe that terrorism is deeply ingrained in their system.
It's a complicated situation for sure, a long and difficult history to unpack there.
Absolutely.
But even with that backdrop, Modi talks about inviting Pakistan to his swearing-in ceremony, expressing hope for peace. How do you reconcile those two things?
It seems like he's trying to find a balance. He's not letting Pakistan off the hook for their actions, but he's also not giving up on the idea of dialogue.
I wonder if it's a case of hope triumphing over experience.
Maybe. It's a tough situation, though.
For sure. How do you engage with a neighbor that seems intent on undermining your security?
It's a question that many countries are grappling with these days.
It is.
Well, I think this sets the stage for a really fascinating discussion. We've got Trump, China, Pakistan, all these complex relationships that Modi is navigating.
Yeah, it's like a giant geopolitical chessboard, and he's making some very strategic moves.
Right. And we haven't even touched on his vision for India's future on the global stage.
Lots more to discuss.
Definitely. We'll dive deeper into all that after the break.
Yeah, and it's interesting, thinking back to Modi's description of his first meeting with Trump at the White House.
Yeah, what about it?
Well, he talks about how Trump gave him this personal tour, no notes, no aides, just the two of them walking around with Trump pointing out these historical details. And Modi was really struck by Trump's deep knowledge of American history.
You don't hear that side of Trump too often, do you? That appreciation for tradition and historical significance.
Right. It's almost a contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of.
And it's especially interesting because Modi himself, he places a lot of emphasis on tradition and cultural heritage. Remember how often he brings up Gandhi and Buddha when he talks about India's role in the world?
Yeah.
So maybe that shared appreciation for history is part of what created that rapport between them.
It really makes you wonder how much personal chemistry between these leaders actually influences the course of global events.
Yeah, it's a question worth considering. After all, at the end of the day, diplomacy is all about relationships, even at the highest levels.
Let's bring it back to India's position on the world stage for a moment.
Okay.
Modi mentions how for centuries, India and China together accounted for over 50% of the world's GDP. That's a pretty mind-blowing statistic.
It really is. It puts into perspective just how much historical weight India carries.
Right, even as it's going through this period of rapid growth and modernization.
Exactly. And Modi seems to be drawing on that legacy as he positions India as a leading voice for developing nations.
Yeah, and he's not shying away from competition either. He talks about the 21st century being Asia's century and how India and China should compete in a healthy way.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, right?
Right.
He's not afraid to assert India's ambitions, even when it comes to a superpower like China. It's like he's embracing this idea of a multipolar world, one where power is distributed more evenly.
Do you think that's possible?
It's a tough question, but I think Modi believes that a multipolar world could actually be a more stable and prosperous world.
But how do you achieve that balance of competition and cooperation, especially with a neighbor that's proven to be, well, let's just say unpredictable at times?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It seems like Modi is taking a multi-pronged approach. He's strengthening India's military. He's building these strategic partnerships with countries like the U.S.
Yeah.
And at the same time, he's engaging in direct dialogue with China to try and manage those areas where they disagree.
So for our listeners out there, why should they care about what Modi thinks or how he's positioning India on the world stage?
That's a good question. I think it's important to remember that India's rise is going to have a ripple effect globally, whether it's through its impact on trade, its role in tackling climate change, or its potential to mediate in conflicts like the one in Ukraine. Understanding Modi's perspective is like getting a glimpse into a future where India is a much bigger player.
I want to go back to Modi's thoughts on Pakistan for a second. He talks about this deeply rooted terrorism issue, but also mentions these hopes for peace. How do you reconcile those two things?
That's really the heart of the India-Pakistan dilemma, isn't it? It's a tough one.
Yeah.
Modi seems to be acknowledging that peace requires more than just wishful thinking.
Right.
It requires a fundamental shift in Pakistan's approach, a genuine commitment to dismantling those terrorist networks.
And ending those hostile actions against India.
Exactly.
But he's also not ruling out dialogue completely.
No.
He actually recounts these efforts to extend an olive branch, even when they've been met with disappointment in the past. It's such a tough situation. I mean, how do you engage with a neighbor who just seems intent on undermining your security?
There are no easy answers. But it's interesting how Modi frames this not just as a regional conflict, but as a global threat.
Yeah, he does.
He points out that the terrorism coming from Pakistan affects not just India, but the whole world.
So he's trying to make it a global issue that requires a coordinated international response.
Exactly. By highlighting the transnational nature of the threat, He's trying to elevate the issue beyond just the rivalry between India and Pakistan and make it a matter of global security.
That's a bold strategy.
Mhm.
Do you think he can really change Pakistan's behavior through international pressure?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's clear. Modi isn't content to just manage the status quo. He's trying to reshape the dynamics of that relationship, even if it means taking a tough stance and calling out Pakistan's actions on the world stage.
So it's not just about talking about peace. It's about creating the conditions for peace by addressing the root causes of the conflict.
Absolutely. And that requires a multifaceted approach. It involves diplomacy, security measures, and working with the international community to put pressure on those who support terrorism.
It reminds us that peace isn't just the absence of war. It's about justice, security, and mutual respect.
Well said. And that's a message that resonates far beyond the borders of India and Pakistan. It speaks to people all over the world who yearn for a more peaceful and just world order.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here today. From Trump to China to the complexities of India and Pakistan. One thing's for sure. Modi is a leader who's not afraid to think big, act boldly, and challenge the way things are.
Absolutely. He's a leader operating on multiple levels. He's building those personal connections, looking out for India's interests, and finding ways to cooperate on global issues. It's a complex dance, but he seems to be navigating it with a lot of skill and determination.
It's fascinating to see how Modi, a leader who's so deeply rooted in Indian tradition, is navigating this complex global landscape.
He's definitely walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
You know, one thing that really stood out to me was his perspective on globalization. He doesn't shy away from the challenges, but he also sees it as a huge opportunity for India to take a leading role on the world stage.
And he talks about how India can act as a bridge between developed and developing nations, sharing its expertise in areas like technology, healthcare, and renewable energy. What do you make of that?
It's a key part of his foreign policy, I think. He sees India not just benefiting from globalization, but actively shaping it, becoming a force for positive change. He's not just talking about taking, he's talking about giving back and making the world a better place.
It's a powerful message, especially for those developing nations who see India as a model, a country that has lifted millions out of poverty and achieved incredible progress while staying true to its democratic values.
It's like he's presenting an alternative to the traditional centers of power. He's challenging that idea that global leadership is a zero-sum game. And he's advocating for a more cooperative approach, one where everyone works together to solve those shared challenges.
Like climate change, poverty, and terrorism.
Right, exactly.
It's a hopeful vision.
Yeah,
One that recognizes how interconnected our world really is.
it really is.
Yeah.
In a world that feels increasingly divided, I think Modi's message of cooperation and shared prosperity offers a glimmer of hope for a more peaceful and sustainable future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Modi's global perspective, what stood out to you most about his approach to diplomacy and his vision for the future?
I think it's his ability to balance that deep sense of national pride with a real commitment to international cooperation. He's not afraid to stand up for India's interests, but he also understands that India's future is tied to the fate of the world.
It's a tough balancing act,
Oh,
but it feels like he's approaching it with a lot of intention.
he is. And I think his focus on dialogue, on personal diplomacy, and that win-win approach to global engagement, that's a valuable lesson for leaders everywhere.
He's definitely given us a lot to think about. What role do you think a leader like Modi, representing a rising power like India, can play in shaping a more stable and cooperative world in the years to come? That's something worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. It's fascinating to see how Modi, a leader so deeply rooted in Indian tradition, is navigating this complex global landscape.
He's walking a tightrope for sure. You know, one thing that really stood out to me was his perspective on globalization. He doesn't shy away from the challenges, but he also sees it as a huge opportunity for India to take a leading role on the world stage.
And he talks about how India can act as a bridge between developed and developing nations, sharing its expertise in areas like technology, healthcare, and renewable energy. What do you make of that?
It's a key part of his foreign policy, I think. He sees India not just benefiting from globalization, but actively shaping it, becoming a force for positive change. He's not just talking about taking, he's talking about giving back and making the world a better place.
It's a powerful message, especially for those developing nations who see India as a model, a country that has lifted millions out of poverty and achieved incredible progress while staying true to its democratic values.
It's like he's presenting an alternative to the traditional centers of power. He's challenging that idea idea that global leadership is a zero-sum game and advocating for a more cooperative approach, one where everyone works together to solve those shared challenges, like climate change, poverty, and terrorism.
It's a hopeful vision, one that recognizes how interconnected our world really is.
It is. In a world that feels increasingly divided, I think Modi's message of cooperation and shared prosperity offers a glimmer of hope for a more peaceful and sustainable future.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Modi's global perspective, what stood out to you most about his approach to diplomacy and his vision for the future?
I think it's his ability to balance that deep sense of national pride with a real commitment to international cooperation. He's not afraid to stand up for India's interests, but he also understands that India's future is tied to the fate of the world.
It's a tough balancing act, but it feels like he's approaching it with a lot of intention.
He is, and I think his focus on dialogue, on personal diplomacy, and that win-win approach to global engagement, that's a valuable lesson for leaders everywhere.
He's definitely given us a lot to think about. What role do you think a leader like Modi, representing a rising power like India, can play in shaping a more stable and cooperative world in the years to come? That's something worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.